Well, welcome everyone. Today we will be praying, and you'll be hearing from our candidates for bishop, and all of them will speak to each question. There won't be any question that is specific to one, and so they'll all be answering it. I'll be the moderator. My name is Rick Veit, and I'm the rector here at St. Mark's. And it is being live streamed as well. And so people in the internet are watching this, and then it will be uploaded later as well, if any of you want to watch it on the TV. So,
where's the camera, Rick?
What's that?
Where's the camera?
Oh, good. Where's the camera? It's all the way in the back.
Okay.
Underneath, just to the right of the
Okay.
shepherd window there. And so that's, it could focus in on your nose if you wanted to, or your whole body, or whatever. So with that, let's open with prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray for a collect for quiet confidence. O God of peace, who hast taught that in returning and rest we shall be saved, in quietness and in confidence shall be our strength. By the might of thy Spirit lift us, we pray thee, to thy presence, where we may be still and know that thou art God. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, I want to thank you all for coming to this. We are blessed that you're here, and as we prepared for this, we prayed together, and wanting this experience not just to be an interview, but a real faith experience, growing in the Lord even as we meet. They'll be launching off throughout Wyoming as we go here this week into hundreds and hundreds of miles and cities and churches all over the place. And so we're honored to have you at St. Mark's. and really St. Christopher's here in Cheyenne. I know some of you were present here also to launch this whole week. There are restrooms in the back. We're getting some feedback from those speakers, so I'm going to come right here. There are restrooms. There is some water available. If anyone needs any, the ushers can help you. Each person will introduce themselves, and again, every person will answer the same questions today in no particular order. There are also a whole bunch of other, there's tons of questions that have been submitted. You're going to hear some of those today, and you may be wondering, well, wait, why didn't we hear all of them? If we don't get through them, you'll hear them other times during this week, and they'll be live streamed at other churches as well. So they'll be asked all the questions during this entire week, so that's important to know. Each candidate will have 4 minutes to answer the questions, and so that's a piece. I've already talked to them about it. Thank you to Douglas Sunderland, our timekeeper, and she's here from Cody, Wyoming, so we're thankful that you're here as well. Over 90 questions were submitted, and so we're thankful for all the people that sent those in. You may not recognize the exact wording of your questions if you did send them in. And what we've done, if we had 10 questions that were all similar, the committee put them together into one question. So that's important if you're wondering, hey, wait. And so there's also some questions that were presented, like, we want to hear all about the spouses and things like that. And we're not allowed to ask that. We're not allowed to have them answer. This is, of course, if they have spouses or families, you'll find out all about them later, but this is a chance to interview the candidates for the Bishop of Wyoming. So thank you for being part of this faith experience in worshiping the Lord and answering these questions. So a reminder that candidates, you all have microphones that have an on-off switch, so I may stop you if I don't hear you coming through or anything. And if we have any feedback, I may send you with one of these as well. So with that, let's get started. So what we'd like to know from each of you is your name, what church you serve at now, or really what department or faith community you serve at now, and also what town you come from. What town you're serving in now, excuse me. So your name, your church or faith community, and what town you're from. And then why don't you add on what book you're reading, if you're reading a book, and would you recommend it? So with that, Mary, why don't you start and go for it. Welcome.
I was told I need to pause for a minute, so very important. So I am the Reverend Mary Erickson. I serve as Associate Rector at St. John's Jackson. My husband, Bruce, here, and I moved to Jackson with our 2 children in 2006. I've been part of this wonderful diocese for 14 years. And I live in Jackson, obviously, right? So that makes sense. What book am I reading? This sounds like I'm pandering. I'm really not, but I am reading the book that was sent to us about the Cathedral Home for Children because I wanted to learn more about them. So it's not, and I recommend it because there's some great history in there. That's it.
David, you want to go next?
You're still getting just a little bit of feedback.
Yeah.
Not sure.
Do you want to use this?
Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Good morning. I'm David Dupre. I'm currently serving in a parish setting at Christ and St. Luke's in Norfolk, Virginia, as well as my full-time job, which is a chaplain for the United States Navy on board the USS John C. Stennis, which is also stationed in Norfolk. So I have a wonderful relationship with the church community there at Christ and St. Luke's. It's my second time on a carrier, second time in Norfolk, so it's a wonderful relationship that spanned about 7 years now of being on their adjunct staff there at the church. And my wife Rochelle could not be with us today. She's teaching school this week, all week in Sheridan, and only gets 2 days off a semester. So she's going to take next Monday off and ride the last 3 days with us. So she sends her regards. And I just finished reading Todd Bolsinger's book, Canoeing the Mountains. And if you want to learn more about Fresh Expressions, that program which is up and rising and doing so well in the diocese, it's a great book to learn about the West, to learn about the Lewis and Clark expedition, and these wonderful themes that have to do with Fresh Expressions. So I would highly commend that book. Did I cover all the pieces?
I think so.
And it's a huge privilege to be here.
Yeah.
I should just say, and be with Mary and Paul Gordon, and just thanks to the search committee and standing committees for inviting us to be here. So thank you and good morning.
Paul?
Good morning, and thanks for hosting us so graciously in this place. And for our road show, we're on the road, and actually we end up back in Cheyenne, so maybe we'll sing for you when we return. We'll have practiced a lot. My name is Paul Gordon Chandler. It's a hyphenated name, Paul Gordon, because I grew up in a French culture. You know how they do Jean-Marc, Marie-Louise, and all of that. It's a little bit of a curse in my own culture because it's a mouthful, to say the least. I live in Doha, Qatar, in the Persian Gulf right now as the rector of the Anglican Church in Qatar, which includes the Church of the Epiphany and then the Anglican Center. And one of the Anglican Center's roles is to host 85 other guest congregations on the property. So it's a fascinating place to be. I often say it's like living between the Flintstones, the world of the Flintstones, and the world of the Jetsons. You remember that cartoon, the Jetsons? So you kind of live in a rock quarry, but it's also futuristic there in many ways. So it's a fascinating place to be. My wife Lynn is here, Lynn Chandler. I often say that if anyone likes me and they meet her, then they love me. And I really feel that in many ways. She's a musician and a community volunteer. We have 2 kids. They're married, and we are, as of about 4 days ago, grandparents as well. So, and thankfully, my grandson, my new and first and only, waited until I arrived from Qatar to enter the world. So it's been an exciting time for us. Book-wise, I'm just starting The Splendid and the Vile, which is Eric Larson's new book, marvelous author, and it's about the real first year of Churchill being prime minister in World War II, and how that year anything could have happened, but because of Churchill, it went the way that it did. So thank you.
Very good, thank you. I'm going to call an audible here because we are continuing to get this feedback right in this space. And I think what I'm going to do, take your water with you and take your folders and everything. I'm going to have you scoot back a little bit there, if you would. And Mary, why don't you sit in that front pew right there. And Paul, why don't you sit here.
Right
and
here.
then, yeah, and then David, why don't you sit in that same pew over by Mary.
Okay.
And let's try this, because I think I rarely get feedback from here. So when you speak, why don't you just come up here, or David, you can just come around here. All right? You don't need to come all the way up if you don't need to.
Rick, it's actually the ghost.
It is
that
a
are
ghost.
making their
That's
presence
right.
known. in the
That's
building.
correct. The Holy Ghost
The
is
Holy Ghost,
speaking
there you
through
go.
the feedback right now. Yeah. So let's see. We started with Mary last time. So David, why don't you go next? And if you would tell us the part of your faith story that called you to be a candidate for the Bishop of Wyoming. The part of your faith story, or that called you to be a candidate for the bishop in Wyoming. And again, why don't you just come around by those steps, because the camera will come right in on you, just anywhere right there.
That's a beautiful story, and I wish we had more of an ability to interact. I should just call out how stiff this all is. And how weird it was entering a church in complete silence without any singing and without interacting, and then being able to recognize some faces over the masks. And by the way, we can see you smile over the top of the mask. So if you would please, that'd be very helpful to us. We can see your smile through your eyes, and hopefully you'll see mine. I will choose one part of my faith story that I believe applies. And that is that when I was in college, I had all the pieces of faith, but I had not put them together, or they had not come together. I had had experiences of God as a young person through various opportunities, through youth programs and camps, to really feel God's presence. But then I would, like the seed that was sown on soil that wasn't very loamy, that seed just didn't really take root. And so I'd go along again, and I'd have another experience as a young person growing up. And then when I got into college, I joined a youth organization of a Lutheran church in Columbus, Ohio, while I was in college. And for the first time, I was surrounded by people who were adults my age, who were living their faith 24/7. And that caused me to really consider bringing all those pieces of faith together. And when that happened, it was a very powerful implosion of all those pieces that congealed into a whole. And the part of the faith journey that I would point out is that when that happened, it was really confirmed by the people around me. One of my friends who was there in that group, her name is Tanya Southwick, recently she told me she remembers the moment when God got a hold of me in that room with those young people in that worship setting. So it was confirmed. And then I went along, and I thought I was going to be an architect. I wanted to be an architect, to follow in my father's footsteps. So I was eating it, sleeping it, drinking it. But then I was in this wonderful youth organization, and I was learning how to play the guitar. We were sharing through drama and song the message of the gospel with other young people. And I was seeing that take effect. And I began to sense a call to ministry. And when that happened, again, there was confirmation. People said to me, hey, we knew that was what God was doing in your life. We were just waiting for God to tell you. So that was confirmation. And then in this process, as folks invited me to submit my name, and as I began to talk with bishops and clergy and family, there was a tremendous amount of confirmation to say, yes, we think you should go forward with this. And all along the way, through the voices of God's people and through God's Spirit as well, there's been confirmation. And so I think we're all supposed to be here. Mm-hmm. And that's very confirming. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Paul, why don't you go next? Tell us a part of your faith story that called you to be a candidate for the Bishop of Wyoming.
I'll go back. One of the gifts of this, by the way, is we get to learn about each other everywhere we go, which is great. I grew up in a church family. My father was a minister of the International Church in Senegal, West Africa. So all things church I experienced, and it was the last thing I ever wanted to do with my own life at that time. So when I went into university, I wanted to be a diplomat. I'd grown up around U.S. embassies. But I was roomed with someone who I didn't know from Adam, named Greg, who had such a dynamic relationship with God. I'd never seen anything like it before. And as a result of his life, it became for me what I would consider my kind of Damascus Road experience, really a transformational experience for me, of really committing my life to God. And as a result of that, immediately my passion changed toward wanting others to experience and to connect and grow spiritually with God. So I changed my major. I entered into theological studies from political science. And that started me kind of on a track all the way through. In terms of Wyoming and the Episcopate, as I looked, to me, I've never been able to separate, for me in every place I've served, the place from the calling. They've been together. And so we can talk about Wyoming later, but as to the calling to the Episcopate, as I looked at the experiences that I've had the opportunity of having, my background and sense of real calling, that role seemed to fit. But it was never really exercised or pursued until location, calling to a place, came about. And so in many ways, that's what this is. But I would say this, the dominant theme for my life is back when I was not long after making that commitment to Christ and following in his way. A professor on the front row, he said, Paul Gordon, he said, never ever worry about the breadth of your ministry. Worry about the depth and let God take care of the breadth. And it's been a guiding principle for me in whatever role, whether it's a small church in North Africa or a role like this that I've found that I go back to over and over again. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Mary, tell us the part of your faith story that called you to be a candidate for bishop in Wyoming.
Thank you. I was so worried about the mic working before that I didn't think to say thank you for all being here. This is great, and to kick us off onto this long week. So I think my journey to the priesthood, like the two of you, was a life journey. I was raised in the Episcopal church, but my mother remarried when I was quite young, and my stepfather was anti-church, so he stopped going. But I always felt this deep connection, and I was afraid that I would offend him, so I would go into my closet and pray as a little girl, which is sort of sad. But there was always this fascination and this connection, and I always felt drawn to the church and my faith and God. As when I made the decision to go to seminary, I actually had been going to a Unitarian church, and I went to become a Unitarian minister, and it was about 3 months in when I realized that the Unitarian church didn't hold the depth and the spirit for me, and that the person of Christ was actually really important to me. And so I went back to the Episcopal church and decided not to be ordained at that time, just because there was, I had not gone in care of a church and needed some time to make that decision. I would never say this to my Unitarian friends, and hopefully none of them will watch this, but the idea of becoming a Unitarian minister felt very different from becoming an Episcopal priest. It was a heavier mantle, and I wasn't quite ready to make that decision. So I went back into the corporate world. I met my husband and moved to rural South Dakota and had children. And it wasn't until I got to St. John's, and I've always thought you need to feel personally called, be called by God, and be called by a church or an institution. And it was not until I got to St. John's that I felt all of those things pulling on me. I knew it was something I would do eventually, so I became a priest. I also didn't mention that I currently run a nonprofit that works with low-income children in Jackson, empowering low-income children. And I, for the past 5 years, have struggled a little bit with what it means to be a priest outside of the church and what that really looks like. It's my ministry without question, but the church itself, and I continue to serve in churches the whole time, but that disconnected, and I look at my background, and I have a business background, I have a church background, and I have this nonprofit background, and it always felt very disconnected in a way. And a few years ago, a friend asked me about if I'd ever considered becoming bishop. And I looked at my background, I said, well, I don't really have, I've never really thought about it. And so I started discerning. And as I started discerning, more and more people would come to me and ask me that question, which is the confirmation that you were talking about, David, that sense of, okay, I'm feeling called to this in some way. And the more that I thought about the role, the more I realized it brought all of these parts of my life together in a way that made sense. And it made me feel as though I had been working for this my whole life, and I had no idea that that's where I was going. I think the administrative side, the spiritual side, the pastoral piece really helping organizations to find their way forward and leading into the future. All of those pieces sort of came together in this role. And so I think that call from the outside, the personal call in that sense of, I feel deeply called to this and I feel abundantly prepared. And those things really came together for me. So that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. This next question, Paul, I guess we'll start with you on this one. This is regarding LGBTQIA community, and Wyoming Episcopalians are working on issues surrounding the full inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersexual, and asexual persons and their allies. How have you led others to address this issue, and with what results? And then just a tag to that, how would you support churches who want to nurture deep hospitality for this community of people while honoring those who disagree with their stance? So how have you led others to address this issue, and with what result? And then how would you support churches who want to nurture deep hospitality even while honoring those who disagree? So Paul, why don't we start with you on this?
Obviously, that's a sensitive subject for many, and it has been for our own church over the years. I actually served in a diocese for 10 years that was adamantly anti the U.S. Episcopal Church. I was the only U.S. Episcopal priest in the diocese. This is the Diocese of Egypt. So I lived with this kind of dichotomy and this tension every day. From a theological and from a psychological standpoint, I would say that I really profoundly believe that we see the image of God in everyone. We're all endowed with that. And our job, I think, from a spiritual standpoint, especially as priests, but all of us, is to further that image of God, who that person was created to be. And I love this illustration of like this beautiful vase, clear vase that we all have inside, but sometimes there are all kinds of layers over it that prevent that vase from being shown for its beauty. And I think our role is helping take off those layers. And in that sense, our role is to help that individual, whoever they are, to become fully whom God created them to be. On the flip side of that is the issue that not everyone agrees with whom that person was created to be. And I grew up in a context, my own family, church, that was very anti that. And I just think of my own story of how I changed, and I changed by experiences that I had. We all change and are shaped by the experiences that we have. And so in one way, I think the church, especially the Episcopal Church, where inclusivity is one of our primary gifts, secrets really, as we look to the future, is allowing and facilitating, being a catalyst for people to have an experience of the other, whomever the other is. And in doing that, sensitivity, because there's a sense that, having come from my own background, the starting point is a different starting point for everyone. And so I think we build those bridges cautiously, unpolitically, theologically, but with kindness and acceptance to all, even those who disagree with that. And so it's this gradual pilgrimage we're all on, and acknowledging that for each of us. There's that wonderful verse in Psalm 82, "Blessed are those who have set their hearts on pilgrimage." And we're all pilgrims, we're all journeying. We don't stop, we don't arrive. We think we arrive sometimes, but we don't. And I think that's probably the most accurate way to describe us, and very much when it looks and addresses this issue.
Very good. Thanks, Paul. Mary, why don't you go next with this question? And again, I'll restate it. Wyoming Episcopalians are working on issues surrounding the full inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersexual, and asexual persons and their allies. How have you led others to address this issue, and with what results? And then as a tag, how would you support churches who want to nurture deep hospitality for this community while honoring those who disagree with this stance?
Great, thank you. It is a sensitive question. Similar to what you're saying, Paul Gordon, that deep sense that we see the presence of God in all people. And I often return also to our baptismal covenant that says that we respect the dignity of all human beings. And so when I look at those two pieces that really inform my faith, for me it's never been a big issue, but I understand that it is something that a lot of us struggle with. So I think there's been two situations where I've really had to deal with this head on. One, if you remember, when we first started doing same-gender blessings in Wyoming, there was a process that we had to go through as churches to be able to be okay to do that. And they were difficult conversations, but we'd meet in small groups and talk about this decision and what our response as a church would be. And there were people in those conversations who were not comfortable with that decision. This was pre-marriage and all of that. But we would talk and we would turn to Scripture. And I think coming at it from a perspective of acceptance and love, it didn't become political. I mean, these things can't be political. We have to come at them from a sort of moral, theological perspective. We did end up agreeing to do the blessings at St. John's, but there were some vestry members who really needed to be brought along, so it was a process. We also had a youth pastor for several years in St. John's who really struggled with this. And he and I we would just sit and talk for hours about this. He had a young boy in his youth group who was struggling with his own sexuality. It was really important to our youth pastor to be able to be there for him. So he had to come to terms with his own issues around homosexuality. And so we would sit and just listen and read Scripture and reinterpret things and open our hearts, and eventually he really got to a place, I think it's probably something he'll always struggle a little bit with, but he got to a place where he felt like he could show up for that young man, which was really important. And I think that's a big part of it. As communities of faith, we need to be loving and open and accepting of all people, because statistics show when kids don't feel like they're welcome, the suicide rates are higher. I mean, there's so many things that happen that if we can't show up for our children who are struggling with that, that's a real problem. So it is something that I have felt positive about in both of those examples. And I think you do the same thing as a church, where you continue to have an open dialogue. You continue to honor where people are coming from, and just keep talking and keep having a conversation with them. Again, grounded in theology, grounded in our own moral standing, looking at the baptismal covenants. All of those things are ways that we can move those conversations forward in a loving way. And I think as long as we do that, we can get to some common ground.
Very good, thank you. And David, again, Wyoming Episcopalians are working on issues surrounding the full inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersexual, and asexual persons and their allies. How have you led others to address this issue, and with what results? And then as a tag, how would you support churches who want to nurture deep hospitality for this community while honoring those who disagree with this stance?
Thank you. It's a beautiful question. And I think that leading and supporting, those two parts of the question, go hand in hand. When we lead well, we're also supporting. I think for me, leadership in this issue goes back to the time when Gene Robinson was elected as bishop in New Hampshire. I was at that time rector of St. Peter's in Sheridan, and we certainly did not have a community that was unanimously in support of that decision. And that was a real dividing point for the American Episcopal Church. And so leading at that time, at that point in time in the history of the Episcopal Church, I think was really essential. What I did was to write a letter to the parish, and one of the things in that letter used the image of walking up to the door of the church and looking carefully at the invisible signs, not just the marquee and the welcome sign, but for us to really carefully ask ourselves, are there invisible signs over the doors of our church that say that such and such a person is not welcome in our church? And to ask our entire congregation to deeply think about that question. And then to strive to be a kind of congregation where we could walk up to the front door of our church and not find any invisible signs. Then the other thing we wanted to try to do, even though we did not have unanimity of opinion, is to remain strongly a family. And that we would come together for our Thanksgiving dinner, not just once a year, but every Sunday. And that we would break bread together and continue to be a family, even if we weren't fully in agreement. If you launch all the way forward to my current ministry, you know, when the Department of Defense says, you're going to include these people, you're going to include these people, and it's not a dialogue, and there are no meetings, and there's no committee, it's just, we get an order, and folks, this is the order. And when we crossed that threshold, it made a huge difference in the community of the United States Navy, of which I am a part. And so leading on a warship, leading on a carrier has meant that I've become a part of the LGBTQIA community aboard the carrier. There's a club there. They get together. They talk about their struggles. They talk about their needs. And I became a chaplain to that group of people. And on one evening, when they asked me to speak, I chose to allow them to speak about their church experiences and how they may have experienced alienation from the church or those invisible signs. And it was a very, very healing evening for us. And so that leading is also supporting, I hope that you can see. And that at Christ in St. Luke's, the church where I worship, you could see walking into that beautiful place every Sunday before COVID, a full church of people and a community that is fully, fully inclusive. And it's a joy to be a part of that. So as I consider ministry in Wyoming, I would consider continuing to encourage us to see that we are not just, I am made in God's image, but acknowledging that you are made in God's image. And we need to really listen first and listen to the stories and the lives and the fabric of the people who are different from us in a way that we can acknowledge Christ in them, that we would seek and serve Christ in all persons, truly loving our neighbor as ourselves, and that there would be no invisible signs.
Thank you. We're going to shift topics here towards small congregations. 24 of our 46 churches are quite small and face economic and population declines in their towns. What kind of experience do you have with small, rural, congregational development? And then as a tag, what does congregational growth and vitality mean to you? So what kind of experience do you have with small, rural, congregational development? And what does growth and vitality mean to you with regards to congregations? And Mary, why don't we start with you?
So over the last 5 years, I've had the great honor of serving quite regularly in the Episcopal Church in Alta, Wyoming, which is actually in the Diocese of Idaho, ironically, we're not sure why. And that has been a really important experience for me in terms of seeing what it takes to keep some of these smaller churches going. The energy and the enthusiasm and the commitment, because it really is about the congregation. We found that when we were in Aberdeen, South Dakota, and the pastor left very quickly, the priest left very quickly, and the church rallied around, and they became a stronger church by virtue of having to show up and be present for each other. So I think there's a great gift in some of that. In that you're in a big church like St. John's, I don't know about Cheyenne, you have a staff and you look to everyone to do all these wonderful things for you. In a smaller church, it is important that everyone play a part and everyone is invested in the life of the church. I don't think there's a cookie cutter solution for any of us. I think the role of the bishop in the diocese is to really work with the churches individually, church by church, to figure out what are you called to do. You know, if you're in a small aging church in an aging community and your response to that is we want more young families, probably doesn't make sense. But how can you serve one another and your greater community in a way that does result in growth? And when I talk about growth, it's not always growth in numbers. It is growth in spirituality, in faith, in the outreach that we do to our communities, in relationship, and all of those things. So I think that our small churches need to figure out, and don't get me wrong, I am continually amazed by the work that our smaller churches do. I am impressed by the level of dedication. So I know we've got all of those pieces, but I think, money follows ministry, and we really need to make sure that our churches are living into what they feel called to be. And that is a process that I would hope as bishop I would help each of our churches sort of follow it, explore that together and then resource them, but not just financially, although that's a piece of it, but resource our smaller churches with best practices and collaborative environment between all of us where we can learn from each other, training, whatever different pieces are necessary. But that, I think, there's incredible potential for our churches to thrive and be deeply spiritual places, and reach out to their community in new ways that spread and nurture God's love in the world and in their communities.
Very good, thank you. And Paul, why don't we have you go next this time? So again, what kind of experience do you have with small rural congregational development? And then what does congregational growth and vitality mean to you?
Mm-hmm. I remember when I took the role in Cairo, Egypt, the profile of the church was an encouraging one. And when I got there and we went to our first service, there were 12 people. And I remember thinking, I don't know if the vestry was really honest with what they said. And but it was a real special opportunity to take really the small community and allow them to think creatively. How can they really serve Christ most effectively and strategically in that context? And I would say every context is so unique. And the same thing happened when I was in Tunis, Tunisia as well. Those are both very small churches that grew, but of course they're limited in their growth because of the context that they're in. And that's very much the way, of course, small rural churches are limited in the sense of numerical growth. If you've got a village or a town or a little city of 200, it's not going to be a mega church. So those kinds of church growth strategies often, of course, are not appropriate in that context. And so I think it means looking at each church specifically, paying close attention and listening to what that community needs, and how can the church play a very distinct role, their niche in that community, of serving really embodying the kingdom of God in that context. In Qatar, where I am right now, it's kind of interesting because while our building hosts all these churches, these 85 churches, some of them are very small, and all 85 of those churches have bivocational priests or non-stipendiary ministers. And some are tiny, 12 people. Taxi driver is the pastor. The others are some larger congregations, a few hundred, that have an engineer who works for the gas and oil industry as the pastor. So what our role is helping each one, because they're full of opportunities and challenges, and being sensitive to those challenges and finding creative ways to resource who that congregation is supposed to be in that context.
Thank you, Paul. And David, if you would, what kind of experience do you have with small rural congregational development, and what does congregational growth and vitality mean to you?
My time in small congregation ministry goes back to 1987 when I was a candidate for ordination, or I was becoming a candidate for ordination and I was invited to spend a summer in Big Piney as a seminary intern. So we ministered in Big Piney under the direction of the priest in Pinedale, so also in Pinedale, in Bondurant, and down in LaBarge. So all of those are small towns, so that's my foundation, and there's a great love for that ministry. Up in Sheridan, Sheridan's a fairly big town, but the parish of Sheridan is quite large. If you go west, you hit Wolf, then if you go north, you hit Manchester and Dayton, and then up to Kirby, Montana, Bernie, Montana, Otter, Montana, Claremont, Wyoming, and down into Story, Wyoming, and that's about the well larger than the size of Rhode Island. So all of those small towns there. So I think the key is pastoral care to start with. I love the listen first. We've talked about listening to the needs of the community, but the key is pastoral care. Who does the pastoral care? The ministers. Who are the ministers? The lay people, the deacons, the priests, and the bishops. Taking seriously that all 4 orders of ministry, including the laity, are the ministers, and together we do pastoral care. If you want to go to the cutting edge today, you can get on the Fresh Expressions US website, and you can become a recipient of their emails. One of the cutting edge, I mean right on the edge right now, the things that they're talking about in COVID is dinner church. Right? Giving tools that, hey, maybe we could get together with people who don't come to churches, and we could have a meal, and we could develop a fellowship around that. Check it out. It's all great stuff. But guess what? Since the very beginnings of the Diocese of Wyoming, what have you been doing in small communities all over? We've been having dinner church. We've been getting together from far distances and driving long miles to bring food together and to celebrate together and to worship together. So what is brand new and what is cutting edge is something that we've also been doing in communities for many, many years. And I think for pastoral care and growth and vitality, we have to be there. We have to go out to the very, very edges of the domain of the parishes and our work in the diocese, and we have to show up. And we have to be present in times of crisis and in times of joy. And for me, way back to Big Piney, that was riding a tractor and harrowing fields and working in the oil field and substitute teaching in the schools. And the more that you are embedded into the life of the community, the more trust is built and ideas are generated and wonderful things begin to grow in the life of the community. And if they know that you love them and they know that you care about them in the most isolated places, then they'll call you when they need. And community is built around all of the wonderful celebrations of life through all of the stages of our lives. Pastoral care through all of the ministers and raising up wonderful spirit-filled ideas from those communities brings life and vitality. Thank you.
And David, why don't you just go ahead and stay up there? All of you go first this time, if you would. Thank you. This is regarding youth ministry, which I think would probably include children's ministry, depending on how you define it. Teenagers, kids, everyone. How have you addressed the challenge of developing ministry for youth with connections to the Episcopal Church? And how would you help us proclaim the good news of resurrection to a young person who's never heard it?
From the first days of ministry, I saw the church as intergenerational. I wanted to value the oldest members in the congregation, and I wanted to bring the children forward and speak in a way that they could understand. And guess what? When we began to do that, the oldest members of the congregation enjoyed that as much as the youngest members. So seeing the churches as intergenerational. Youth ministry in Big Piney meant that we started an after-school church school on Wednesday afternoon. Bishop Jones called me up and said, we have this abandoned bus nobody wants. It was one of those short little buses, but it was painted blue, it was a decent looking little bus. And we went and we picked this thing up and drove it back to Big Piney. We would show up at the elementary school in Big Piney every Wednesday afternoon, and kids, it was not safe, folks, okay? There were no seat belts. There was no, we weren't taking numbers. Kids just packed in that little bus. And so we ended up with about 20% of the elementary school and blew the doors off the church on Wednesday afternoons. Kids singing beautiful programs. And that was because we had the sense that the entire community was involved. And there were a lot of kids there that were not churched. There was an abandoned pizza restaurant that you could look in the windows, you could see there were video games in there and pool tables, and it had been abandoned for a long time. So we developed an idea in cooperation with the town and the county. The county paid the money to lease the center. We called it Primetime Youth Center. We opened up on Fridays and Saturday nights for 6 hours, from 6 to midnight on Fridays and Saturdays, as a place for young people to come and hang out. We never had a church service in that place. It was just a place where people could be and be safe. And that drew kids from all over the community, and a lot of those young people ended up going to youth convention in the diocese, or happening in the diocese, or other things that were happening, or come to the youth groups that we were having for kids in the community. In Sheridan, we continued that on through a vital youth ministry and reaching out to the whole community. So I believe the key to that young person you're talking about who hasn't heard the faith is that we see that all four orders of ministry are really ministers. And so children begin to see that their word is important as well. And if they're going to this really cool thing, they might invite their neighbors who don't go to church or don't know who Jesus is. And in this beautiful way that builds community, people come through the doors who have no idea who Jesus is, or we might meet in some other setting that's outside of the church. And so just by the gospel naturally spreading through the course of our living our lives, those young people begin to receive invitations to come to these gatherings. And they begin to hear the gospel shared in terms that they can understand. So I've seen it happen in beautiful ways that are vital. And as I look now at the Diocese of Wyoming again, I would want to begin anew and listen carefully and find out what's been happening here for the last 12 years, and to see how we might listen and build community amongst children's ministries and youth ministries throughout the diocese. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, David. Mary, do you want to go next?
Sure.
And as you come forward, how have you addressed the challenge of developing ministry for youth with connections to the Episcopal Church, and how would you help us proclaim the good news of resurrection to a young person who has never heard it?
Okay. I mentioned that, for the past 3 years, I have run an organization that empowers children and youth all the way from kindergarten through the end of high school in Jackson, low-income kids who don't have access to all that our community has to offer. When I started there 3 years ago, we had fewer than 100 kids, and they were basically skiing, and what we were doing is buying their ski passes and providing them with equipment. But our mission was to empower kids. And so I really evaluated, are we just giving them access to skiing, or are we really empowering them? And so we really did a whole analysis of the organization and our programs, and what did we have? What was our greatest asset? And we realized our greatest asset was trust and relationship that we had built with these kids and this population of people, primarily Latino in Jackson, with families, and that we would build on that. So we have evolved over the last 3 years to include a mentoring aspect of what we do. And we have adult mentors who work in groups with the kids. And last winter we had 250 kids out skiing. This summer we had 100 kids, which was our greatest summer ever. It was really hard to make it happen during the COVID era, but we figured it out. So for me, it is really about that relationship. I have worked and begun to be a bridge between that community and our church community. Our mentoring groups meet at St. John's, which seems like a little thing, but that's an introduction. And we do have, they all know I'm a priest. I have a few of the moms who will come to me and talk to me for pastoral reasons. So it's just about building those relationships. And I think kids want to connect. They want, they are naturally very curious. I think there's huge opportunity, and sometimes you go in a back door. For us, it's outdoor recreation, and we build those relationships, and we help kids to understand what is possible in their lives. And so I think that's a really important model for us. We also bring a group of kids up from the Wind River Reservation 4 times a year. That was, again, in the beginning, just bringing them up, setting them up on the mountain. Now we engage with them, and we have relationship, and we have developed long-term relationships. And all of that matters. I think it begins for kids with that trust, knowing that they can speak freely and honestly. I think that we need to really look at our diocese. See Candy back here, and Candy and Catherine, who's at St. John's, I think are the only youth pastors in the diocese right now. Is that right, Candy? There's a lot of work to do. Kids want to be a part of what we have to offer, but they just don't, we haven't figured out how to engage them in really powerful ways. And so I think we just, we approach the kids in ways that resonate for them and bring them in. I think Candy's done an incredible job by opening the gospel for kids that have never had that access before. And so I went back, I said earlier about collaborating as a diocese. There are wonderful things happening. There's some knowledge out there, and we need to really work together to spread those ideas across the diocese. And I think my time at Coombs gives me a real heart for that, and understanding that you meet the children where they are, and then you bring them along with you. And so it's been an incredible experience for me to watch the transformation in the kids that we work with. And even to see them begin to open their hearts to the presence of God.
Very good, thank you. And Paul, how have you addressed the challenge of developing ministry for youth with connections to the Episcopal Church? And how would you help us proclaim the good news of resurrection to a young person who's never heard it?
You know, there's a lot of wonderful things about our Episcopal Church. But youth ministry, by and large, and even church school, but especially youth ministry, is not one of our great strengths. It's one of our weaknesses. I've had the privilege of traveling and being in around a lot of Episcopal churches in the country, and one of the things that one quickly sees is the dearth of youth and of young people. And we often look on to these other churches that are of different traditions, and we see their massive youth groups. And I'm telling you, the future of the church is connecting with those young people. So it's a big issue. And if we're not worried about it, then I think we should be worried about it ourselves, because it has great ramifications for the future. In Cairo, when we went to this little church, one of the ways we saw that we could really connect to the community and those outside the church was through a youth program. And so we identified someone who actually, some people just have the gift. It doesn't mean their age, it has nothing to do with their age, but they connect with young people. So we sought to identify those individuals and then empower them and then resource them and release them to develop a whole slew of activities and initiatives and programs based on felt interest and felt needs. And so, and of course, within the context of youth, relationship is everything. Hanging with is everything. It's really the ministry of presence. It's not just initiatives and programs and all of that. But one of the things I would say as a church for us as we look to the future, when we think about a new generation, we have to rethink what I would say are two things. One is I think we have to really seriously continue to explore how we do and be church, getting the church outside of the walls and of our tradition, and being in places that the church is not normally at, actually. And secondly, obviously, if we all had our dream, we'd see, when we come on Sunday morning, we'd see the place full as well with young people. How's that going to happen? There's an element for us as we look to the future that we also have to rethink, not just our outreach and that creativity and being in places where we normally wouldn't be, but also rethinking our worship in some ways. As much as we love our tradition, that rich tradition, it does not, and I think we'd all agree, connect with our teenagers. And yet we have the goods, we've got the resources, we've got the basis for some slight changes. And this is what we found, for example, in Cairo, where it can. So the potential is there. And so I think we've got a wonderful foundation to build on in order to see that happen. But it does require some creativity and rethinking and being where we wouldn't normally be as the church. Thank you.
Thank you. And Paul, go ahead and stay up there. I'm going to ask you another question. This one is a two-part question.
They all seem two parts.
Right. This will be a six-part question.
Okay, there you
No,
go.
I'm just kidding.
I'll get my notes.
What do you perceive is the biggest challenge and asset in our diocese? And what gifts do you bring to address it or nurture it? What do you perceive to be the biggest challenge or asset in our diocese? And what gifts do you bring to address or nurture it? And the second part is describe a time when you faced a leadership challenge. How'd you overcome it?
Those are two big, different questions, aren't they?
Yeah.
Biggest asset and challenge. I think in terms of asset, you have this wonderful history. I'm going to merge the two questions. Is that okay? You have this wonderful history here, tremendous foundation, and health. When it was public that I was looking at this role, someone from the church pension group said, of all the places that they've been with the priest in the diocese for their various seminars and all of that, the happiest priest they found, and sense of joy and all that, was here in Wyoming. So I think in that sense, you're rich and this marvelous base for the future. So I think in that way, you can really lead the way. We can lead the way in terms of even the national church and how we do and be church, to the point where actually people are making pilgrimages here to see what's happening. You want them to be saying, have you heard what's happening in Wyoming? I think we can be that, very much so. In terms of the challenges, I think you have the challenges of, and I think it's a legitimate challenge, is we all talk about bivocational ministry and the gifts of that. But there are also challenges with that as well that we really have to be sensitive and acknowledge. Limitations on what they can do with their time, etc. And so I think that's something, because so many of our churches, vast majority, are related in that way. I also think that we definitely, and I mentioned this briefly in the last answer, we've got to really sit down and rethink how we worship. And it's not so much throwing out, it's not that, but it's building upon and shaping the new as we continue the old. But to connect and allow people to connect to that, to the transcendent, to encounter the sacred, allow for that deeper dimension in their life to be touched. And all out there, we all have the same longing and heart. I do not believe the nuns are done. Mm-hmm. And I don't believe the nuns are truly nuns. But we're the ones to explore and discover that. In terms of leadership, what was the second question?
Describe a time when you faced a leadership challenge and how did you overcome it?
I think in any time you're in leadership, you're just living with challenges all the time. So in solving, let's just talk about conflict in that sense. My experience has been diplomacy is required, which means you really do everything possible to see the issue through the other's eyes. Putting very practical steps in place that are measurable, that you can actually kind of both keep each other accountable toward resolving and keeping that in line and picture. And then also doing everything possible in a conflict scenario, and this is the particular challenge if it's a conflict issue, to keep it from being personal It's so quickly becomes personal on both sides and doing everything to disengage that. And but challenge is part and parcel of leadership. And to me, in that context, relationship and people are everything. The greatest resource is not the foundation, it's the people. People are everything. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. And David, why don't you go next on this one? Again, what do you perceive as the biggest challenge and asset in our diocese? What gifts do you bring to address and nurture it? And then describe a time when you faced a leadership challenge and how'd you overcome it? All in 4 minutes.
I think our greatest challenge across Wyoming is our geography. I think our greatest asset in Wyoming is our geography. My vision has changed in this process. I used to take off from a small town like Sheridan, and I used to look down and try to find the church, try to find my house, and see what I could see. And then I discovered right in the middle of this process, I don't know if you've had this happen, that I took off on an airplane and I said, there's Wyoming. This process has expanded my vision and what I see when I take off in the airplane now, which is this vast, beautiful geography, but it's also a great challenge. Even in the midst of COVID, we've learned some skills of overcoming those geographical challenges. The bishop has done a wonderful job of bringing clergy and leaders together using Zoom and new technology in ways that we were not doing before. So even though we hope that COVID is going to go away and we're going to get back to normal, we also know that when we get past COVID, we're going to keep some of these communication skills and tools that we've gained along the way, so that we as clergy and leaders, ministers in all 4 orders of ministry can communicate now in ways that we weren't before. Through the Iona School and Initiative, more clergy are being raised up so that we can provide sacramental ministries to the smallest of places in Wyoming. Through Fresh Expressions, new ideas are developing, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. And what the bishop would do, as I could conceive it, is looking out over the whole state, listening carefully through each visit and through all the electronic meetings, and asking what I think is one of the most important questions that we can all ask one another, and that is simply, what is God blessing? So in biblical terms, I guess that would be, what seed is growing? But I, as a minister in the Episcopal Church as well as the Navy, I crave for that question to be asked more, so that we share more about things that we're seeing and ways that God is working, and that we're not too prideful to share, nor too fearful to share, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. The seed that grows in Cheyenne might not grow in Lusk, right? So we can't simply take one program or idea that's working here and export it. However, we could try that seed. We could find out how the soil was cultivated. We could find out what they added to it, how they hydrated it, how they nourished the soil. And if we break down those concerns of pride and fear and develop a collaborative environment where everyone really feels free to share what God is blessing or what seed is growing, and we build that collaboration, we can overcome our geographical challenge and make this beautiful, vast landscape an incredible asset. And I believe that can all be done by our working together collaboratively, listening first and seeing what God is blessing. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And Mary, what do you perceive as the biggest challenge in our diocese and asset? And how would you address it, nurture it, and then define a time when you faced a leadership challenge and how did you overcome it?
Okay. I agree, our geography can be perceived as a great challenge. I also think there's this idea that the mainstream church is in decline and that it's a foregone conclusion, and I refuse to believe that. I think sometimes we don't dream big enough and push ourselves high enough. I think our assets are really pretty clear. We have this extraordinary foundation. Both as an Episcopal church, we have an incredible foundation in our history and our liturgy that feeds all of us. And we've built on top of that over the last decade the Iona School, which is not just raising up priests, but putting them at clergy, putting them out into the world in a way that they feel prepared and confident, and they are able to lead this church in new ways. Fresh Expressions is nascent, and yet there's incredible things that are coming out of that movement. So I think we have this wonderful foundation. All of it is possible, and I talked about this before, is because of the people of Wyoming, just the level of dedication and commitment and passion and faith that I see. I sit in a diocesan council meeting or a convention and just hear the stories of the extraordinary things that we are doing in this state, and I am blown away. I am inspired. So I know that we can accomplish great things. This is kind of a non sequitur, but when you talk about leadership, I think of an example. I was sitting in my office one day a few years ago. There's a group of very graphic anti-abortion activists that come to Jackson every year to protest. And one year there was a little scuffle that happened and somebody was arrested. And the next year they were coming and they were going to come to the Boy Scout event. And people were getting really angry. And the level of dialogue, you could feel the heat rising across the community. And a woman came into my office. I'd never met her before. And she sat down and she said, "What are you going to do about this?" Like, what? That was a huge challenge that she threw down for me. I started calling around and came to understand that wherever you were on that very divisive issue, nobody really wanted this group of people to come into our community. And so there was this common ground, like, this is not how we choose as a community to deal with conflict. We want to be more loving. We want to sit down and have a conversation. So I brought this group together of pro-life, pro-choice people, and we began to have this conversation. And it was incredibly illuminating. And we came up with 3 tenets that we wanted to live by as a community: civility, compassion, and love. We made a logo, we made posters, we made t-shirts. Before you knew it, the entire town was covered in these 3 concepts. And people throughout the week, as this group came in with their really graphic, kind of violent signs, they would just walk by. It was a tool to help people not respond. And what it taught me, it was basically living the gospel and spreading the gospel in the world in a way that people could relate to. By the end of the week, there were people that were, with their civility, compassion, love t-shirts, going out and bringing a bottle of water to the protesters.
Right.
Changed hearts. And the day of the big protest, they didn't bring their signs, they came with their Bibles. And one of the most moving moments for me was when my husband Bruce sat on a bench with one of them for about, an hour. It's a really long time. And they talked, and they got to know each other and to understand one another. So in this place where I sort of put on this challenge, I've got to finish up, given this challenge, like, what are you going to do? It's like, how do we as a community respond to this? And I will tell you, people still come to me to this day and say they have their sticker or their poster, and it reminds them to not flip somebody off in traffic, or, it is something that has become an ethos in our community that was transformational.
Thanks, Mary. And I'm going to have you stay up there, Mary. I have another question for you. So racism in the reservation within Wyoming. Most of our congregations are at least 90% white, but we have 2 congregations on the Wind River Reservation, and many of our congregations are working with issues of racism. Tell us about an experience with cross-cultural ministry. What went well? What challenged you? What did you learn?
This has been such a big issue for all of us in this time. So not only are we dealing with COVID, but this social unrest. And it's important. This is something that I have actually spent much of my life working on. I did a lot of anti-racism training when I was in seminary. I have the great pleasure of working with 90% of our kids are Latino in those families, and so I've built relationships. But when I sit down at St. John's and we do a book reading about an anti-racism book, and we sit down and somebody invariably says, well, we're such a white community. Like 40% of our community is actually Latino. And yet people don't see that. So there's so many barriers that we have. So just having that conversation has been really important. I also have the honor to have relationships with several people down on the reservation. We bring the kids from the Arapaho school up, and trying to bring, we have a big festival each year, we had to cancel it this year, where we bring some of the Coombs kids, our local kids, and the Arapaho kids, and some of the kids from St. John's together, to ski together, right? Something really simple so that you just have fun together. And that's been very powerful, just to build relationship. And I think I keep going back to that. It's all really about building relationship, getting to know one another, building trust. When I first started back at St. John's, one of my mandates was to begin to build better relationships with the reservation. So I started going down to church once a month, and then COVID hit, so I haven't been down in a while. But that's really where it begins. It's about building relationship, building trust, so that you can connect in new ways. Children are great in that way. They're a gift for us to begin to build those relationships. But you're right, we have these very white churches, and it's been very hard. We've done several, probably you guys have done too, several book groups we've read over the last weeks, and it feels insufficient because we're reading a book, but there is a point at which we need to learn and grow and deal with our own internal issues before we go out into the world. So I think, don't feel like that work isn't satisfactory, because it's really important to do the hard work yourselves. And I think that the church can help its people, all of our people, to have those conversations in safe ways. The reservation weighs heavily on my heart, I will say. One of the things, when COVID hit, before the churches have done an amazing job of feeding people, before that kicked in, there was not a lot of food, resources being brought to the reservation, so we did several food drives. And to go down into that community and spend time down there, and you realize just the incredible challenges. And I think we can do better as a church in not integrating, but engaging more with the life of the reservation, getting to know one another and really understanding the people.
Very good. Thank you, Mary.
That's it.
David, why don't we have you go next with that one? And most of our congregations are at least 90% white, but we have 2 congregations on the Wind River Reservation, and many of our congregations are working with issues of racism. Tell us about an experience with cross-cultural ministry. What went well, challenged you, what did you learn?
I've never ministered in the center part of Wyoming, so I haven't had a lot of opportunity to work with our Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribes. But working in Sheridan and up into Bernie, Montana, and Kirby, Montana, I did have opportunities to work there with the Crow Reservation and the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. We've talked this morning a lot about listening and about pastoral care and about being there when people need us and building relationships. I saw that happen in those opportunities to listen and learn and grow, and also to build opportunities for dialogue there. In Sheridan, we began a medical mission called Catalucan Medical Missions, and we visited a rural community in the southern part of Mexico, and again, we listened first. We provided care. We didn't go on a preaching and teaching mission, but we heard that they had needs in this community, and we went solely for the purpose of listening. We ended up building a multifaceted medical mission that included some general nursing that included dentistry, optometry, audiology, and then we built a cataract surgery center, which I would offer as the answer to the last question that I didn't provide, a great leadership challenge, how to build a surgery center in a rural community in southern Mexico. What happened with that is that our folks came together and the medical providers began to visit once or twice a year. But then when we came back to Sheridan, we found that we were more in conversation in Spanish with our Latino community in Sheridan. And that need and desire to share language and culture took an international mission and brought it back home to a local sense of mission, so that we even then had some services where they asked us to worship together. And we were able to lead some services in our chapel, Eucharist services in Spanish. So it's multifaceted. It always starts with our desire to listen and to understand other communities and the desire to grow. And then in building relationships through pastoral care, we find that bridges are built and opportunities to share even sacramental ministry can really grow. One of the greatest challenges that I ever had was folks coming to me in rural Mexico and saying, we'd like to have a baptism, we'd like to have a first communion, and we'd like for you to do this for us. And working with our own bishop to say, can I develop my language skills enough to really communicate to these people and to share what needs to be shared in that context. That was a great challenge. It turned out to be a great blessing. And in all these ways, God's Spirit is involved if we are truly listening and truly love the other and desire to learn and grow together.
Thank you, David. And Paul, once again, most of our congregations are at least 90% white. But we have two congregations on the Wind River Reservation, and many of our congregations are working with issues of racism. Tell us about an experience with cross-cultural ministry. What went well, challenged you? What did you learn?
Most of my life has been within a cross-cultural context. It's kind of part and parcel to who I am, having grown up where I did. And really feeling a call, a distinct call, to be a bridge builder between those of different ethnicities, cultures, races, faiths as well. I love to see the world as like this. I'm into the arts, as you may know. See it like this beautiful divine mosaic, with each little chip, each little piece being someone from a different tradition, faith-wise, culture, etc., ethnicity. And it's only when they're all in place that that piece becomes the piece it can be, with the brightest and the beautiful, most beautiful and the richest of colors. So we're about filling in that divine mosaic as the church. What has always been important for me, and I think in this time of really discord and misunderstanding, I think our day calls for a whole new kind of movement. One that simply builds on what we hold in common, with whoever the other is. And we saw this beautiful crescent moon as we came out last night from dinner. And I think in one of my questions I highlighted the answer that was sent on the e-spirit. And that is, I love to see us think of that crescent, that little sliver of what we really have different. But the dark side of the moon, when you see a crescent, most of it's dark. That's what we have in common. But we're so often constantly blinded by the illumination of our differences that we actually can't see all that we have in common. And I think the role of the church, regardless of where it is, in Wyoming or in Cairo, Egypt, or in Philadelphia for that matter, is to be a catalyst, to bring people together that would not normally come together. Because all of us change by experience. And so we're there to create an experience of the other. And then we become most full and most whole in that sense. And for us, I have been passionate about using the arts and culture for that purpose, allowing us to see the other through other lens. And when you use that kind of a thing, or other things similar, the natural walls of defense don't go up, which is why actually we brought our exhibitions here to Wyoming, because Muslim and Jewish artists, you're not known for tons of Muslim populations here in Wyoming. So we thought, let's bring the experience of the other here, and we traveled around with it. Some of you know that's what we've done with those exhibitions. Khalil Gibran has this wonderful line. He said, your neighbor is your other self dwelling behind a wall. In understanding, all walls fall down. And that's what the church is about, bringing those walls down. And we realize that the other is actually a lot more like us than we think. In terms of the Native American population, I actually grew up being constantly reminded that I was an 8th Cherokee. So at our daughter's wedding, the chief of the Cherokee came. And very much part of embracing Native American spirituality. And so even though I'm in the Middle East right now, we're on a project of trying to allow the populace there to benefit from the unique traditions and depth of our Native American brothers and sisters and their spirituality. So it's something that's ongoing, but I think we also, on this area, also need to think outside of the box and think creatively.
Thank you. Just have a few minutes left, actually, and I'm going to end with a very odd question. Well, odd in some ways, and I'm just going to ask that we take 1 minute each, because we've only got a few minutes left. So just give him the red card at the end, if you would, Douglas. And David, why don't we start with you? And we have a foundation that has $95 million or thereabouts. And what is your theology of money in 1 minute? What is your theology of money in 1 minute? Yeah.
Okay, so the 1 minute starts when I start talking, right? So when I sit here and...
Yeah. It's a big question, but it's a coffee hour question, right? Maybe. What is your theology of money?
When I give back, or when I come to the church and I put something in the plate, it's all God's. And so when I choose to give that portion, it's simply a sacrament, a small s, to reflect that God is the owner of the whole thing. And I believe that amongst all the resources that we have, when the plate is passed, because we're in a church now, I want to see everybody get in the plate, figuratively. Like, you don't just put your check in or no, you get in the plate. So then as the priest comes forward and maybe comes behind the altar and lifts up the offering, the priest is lifting up y'all and say, we present ourselves as a living sacrifice. The finances, the money is simply part and parcel of that. And so we offer all back to God for God's work.
Thank you. Paul, again, we have a foundation here, lots of money. What is your theology of money in 1 minute?
I've really never thought of it as a theology of money. I've thought of it more as a theology of stewardship. How do we use in wise and God-honoring ways the resources we've been given? And they're not just, of course, financial. So there's an element often that we overestimate the importance of money. Hence, you find dioceses who put a tremendous amount of emphasis on the quota or their assessment that they have to give the diocese, each church. But we often underestimate as well. And I guess I would say, and since it specifically relates to the foundation, I think one of the roles of the diocese, and certainly the foundation board, is continually being open and assessing how do we use the gift of these resources that we've been given. I've had the privilege of serving on a number of foundations, quite large foundations, and the ones that really worked were the ones that were flexible and hearing God's Spirit. And it might be, as we look to the future, God is saying, yeah, we want to do something a little different with that foundation. Thank you.
Thanks. And Mary, again, our foundation here, what is your theology of money in a minute or less?
Again, I've never thought of it in those terms, but I mentioned earlier, money follows ministry, and I think we are not here to serve. It is here to serve us and to resource us. It is an expression of, we tend as a culture to put a lot of emphasis on our financial wealth. We value that wealth above all else. And in the church, we have an opportunity to flip that around. We are not our money in some ways. But it enables us to be creative and to do new things. And we are incredibly blessed in this diocese to have resources to take chances and to be creative and to step out of our comfort zone and do new things. So I think really it's about the ministry and how does that serve the ministry of the greater church rather than the other way around, which is often as a culture how we live our lives.
Thank you. And this is really time, so you've just gotten a firing hose of questions, and those are only half. And so you'll be receiving some of those again throughout this week and a whole bunch more. But I want to thank you for the gift that you all have given to us. I know you've given an enormous amount of yourselves even before you came today. And in what you've said today, and I know God is glorified, and I know love is carrying on throughout the world just because you all agreed to be a part of this process and to share what you did today and with the support of your families. And so I want to thank you for that today. I'm going to close with a word of prayer. And after we pray, I'll ask the candidates to walk out with me. This is a time when we all love to come around you all and give you big hugs, but we're not supposed to do that right now. So I'm going to have you all step out with me when we're done, and then I'll have the ushers, if you would, dismiss people from the back forward as well. And I want to thank you all as well for coming today and for receiving this, and those that are online. What a great gift it is to have you here with us as well and to be a part of this discernment process. You are a part of this discernment process as well, so thank you. With that, the Lord be with you.
Also
with you.
Let us pray. Lord, I thank you for David and for Paul and for Mary. We lift them up to you right now, Lord, as they try to listen more and more, receive, give, grow in their faith, and discern whether they're supposed to be bishop. We'd ask the same for all of us, Lord, as we discern for them whether they're to be bishop or not. We thank you for this opportunity to come together, to turn to you, Lord, and to turn to each other in love. And so we lift you up and give you praise for this day and this time in this space. We'd ask for your Holy Spirit to lead us always in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
All right. Well, thank you again. And if you could
Thank you.
come with me, and we'll go back to the green room. Yeah, let's give them a big hand.
Should we bring, yeah, come
Bring
on.
our people.
I think,
Sure. Yeah.
sure. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
If you want to know what we really look like, I guess you have to look at the pictures, because of the mask thing. So. Hi there. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.